and they're really codependent on us coming out with the power and cooling systems, because designing a data center at 132 kilowatts per rack is not trivial. There's very few people in the world that can do that. So they're really dependent on the reference designs that we provide, so that customers can actually deploy their solutions. And now with Rubin coming out, it's rumored 240 kilowatts per rack, and then in 3 years it's going to be 1 megawatt. It's really important for the industry to have this blueprint to be able to deploy these solutions as they are developed, like I said, at light speed, like a new generation every year. Yeah, I'm Stephen Carlini with Schneider Electric, and you're watching the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast.
Hi, it's Joshua Feinberg, host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast, and I'm thrilled to be welcoming a very special guest on today's episode. Joining me today is Steve Carlini, who is VP of Innovation and Data Center, as well as the Chief Advocate for AI at Schneider Electric in the greater Boston area. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Nice to be here. Thanks. Finally could do this. That's great.
I'm thrilled we could do this as well. So the first place that I'm really curious to know is, how did you end up in this place where you're in a leadership role from one of the world's leading infrastructure companies in marketing, product, innovation? Was this something that you planned over the course of your career when you were growing up? Did you always think that you'd end up in a role influencing technology on a global basis?
Growing up, I always knew I wanted to do something in the technical field. My father was a long-time IBM-er, and it's a funny story. He took me to a data center when I was 10 years old. They did a company outing at his office. It was at his office, and they actually had a data center, which was, at the time, they had these, underground, bunkers where they were putting the computers. So they're one of the original data centers. But I always knew I wanted to go into a technical field, and I did end up getting an engineering degree, but I never really wanted to use that engineering degree to design anything. I always wanted to use it more as background and get into a marketing and sales type of role. And I originally started my career at Toshiba in Texas. So out of college, I went to the University of Oklahoma. I started my career at Toshiba, and it was, funny enough, the UPS division. So at the time, it was, larger three-phase UPSs mainly, and the smaller UPS systems were, just being developed because, servers were just, and networking was just starting to roll out. And it was an interesting time, because that's also when laptops came out and batteries were starting to be added to computers, and we were always wondering, hey, are they going to start putting batteries in computers, and we wouldn't need these UPS systems? But to this day, they haven't. So it's been that was the start. That was the start of my there weren't really data centers. They were more called computer rooms back then, and they were usually part of a room in another building, and then they just started at the end of my tenure with Toshiba to be kind of their purpose-built buildings.
Yeah, I remember the time well. In the mid 90s, for a few years, I worked in New York in financial services doing enterprise IT support, and we had computer rooms on every floor.
Yeah.
And the desktop support people were allowed in there, and we had a limited role in there. Merrill Lynch actually did have real legit data centers. It's just that was at a completely different centralized level, probably way, way above my grade at the time. Interestingly enough, I actually worked for IBM all the way through college. Oh. The year I graduated was the year they laid off 120,000 people. So all the mentors disappeared, and ended up going into the MSP and VAR world, of which Toshiba actually was one of the many lines that were involved in, and eventually APC.
Yeah. It's funny that, at the time, Toshiba was the number one vendor of laptops. Yeah. But boy, that's changed. They also had, a TV brand, so that's all changed. But what happened was an interesting story. There was a software company called System Enhancements, that APC purchased, and that was the software. They had the software for vendor for all of the UPS companies, and APC purchased them, and they knew a lot of the people at Toshiba, and APC just started hiring all the people that worked for me at Toshiba, um, over 20 people actually in engineering and in marketing and manufacturing. They hired almost everybody. So when I went over to APC, it wasn't like I was going to a company that I didn't know anybody, because I knew a lot of the people that were already over there.
So that's pretty much been the common thread throughout your whole career, is that every single destination has been a first cousin of at least UPS's.
Yeah, yes, pretty much. And I came to APC to run what was called the Smart Ups, Matrix, and Symmetra business, and that was really the only business we had. Now we call it the core business, because we have all kinds of different products, but that was pretty much all we had at the time.
Yeah.
And then we decided, we were highly successful at APC. We were running up into 60% market share in a lot of places, and we just couldn't expand anymore. So we tried, at the time, to move up into the data center space, with larger UPSs, and I was involved with some acquisitions, some cooling companies, and a UPS company out of Denmark. So it was a mad push, which was really different, because APC was channel based, and now we had to hire salespeople to go out and sell into these accounts. So it was.
Yeah, I don't remember at the time how we originally came across APC, but I'm pretty sure we were either buying from Ingram Micro or
Yeah.
Tech Data. At one point, we were in the reliability reseller. We're selling to SMBs. So a lot of it was literally educating the small business owner that they needed battery backups on all the desktops and a bigger one on the server, and having the ability for the server to shut down when the battery was running out, and having some basic monitoring stuff, which also probably seems very, very archaic by 2020 standards, but 25, 30 years ago, it wasn't as well adopted.
Yeah, then 15 years ago or 16 years ago now, Schneider Electric purchased APC for $6 billion. It was up until Aviva, I think it was the largest acquisition for Schneider Electric. And they already had a UPS company, MGE, so there was overlap with what they already purchased. So, but they liked the fact that APC was kind of a smaller, more nimble company, and we had a lot of the relationships, on the IT side, with all of the server vendors, IBM at the time, Dell, HP. So they were very interested in that. And then we had to go through the whole integration process and eliminate all of the redundancies, which was fun.
So with all of that in mind, when you come across people that are at the really early stages of their career, maybe even as young as teens, high school, early college, that are thinking about what they want to do for their careers, knowing what you know now and what you think is coming in the next 5-10 years ago, 5-10 years going out from now, what would you talk about with someone who wants to be in a less technical role? They don't see themselves necessarily as being an engineer or a software developer. They're gravitating towards marketing, sales, account management kind of jobs. What would you talk about with that person over breakfast or lunch?
Well, I talk about the need to have the background. You need to have the background and to understand a lot of the technologies that are being developed. It's really interesting that you have to look at the trajectory of kind of the technology. One of the hottest technology degrees has been data analysis, and there was a lot of people going into college and coming out with these data analysis degrees. And now with AI coming up, a lot of the data analytics jobs are kind of on the chopping block. So looking at some of like the less exciting type of jobs, like even in the UPS industry, where things don't change as fast as they may in some of the data analytics roles, and don't be afraid to not do the most exciting thing. Like when I was in school, there was 90% of the electrical engineers were doing some kind of electronics, and I was one of the few that was more interested in the power systems, and we actually had a path for power systems. So it's a choice, and you never know how it's going to work out. But some of the more traditional types of solutions may have a chance of sticking around for longer than some of the new and emerging ones.
Yeah, it seems the constant reinventing of yourself and trying to keep up with what's next. You may be that last generation that was able to spend most of your career largely with this same company, right? We're basically APC evolved, got acquired into Schneider, and had this very smooth path. But yeah, there's
Yeah, well, it was funny because when during the acquisition, they brought a lot of us into a room, the leaders, and said, we don't need half of you. So it was like, so obviously I started looking, and one of the things they said to me was, you've only worked for two companies. No one's going to want you. You haven't moved around a lot. And I thought that was a good thing, but apparently that was less desirable.
everyone's got different ways of valuing talent and
Exactly.
strategy, and to this day,
Yeah, exactly.
there's 101 different ways of approaching go to market in this industry.
That's for sure. That's for sure. It's and this industry was very I would say conservative, the data center industry, for a long time. And there were some incremental changes. If you think back, 30 years ago, actually the government was involved in regulating the data center industry. They had designs you had to adhere to, and they would inspect them. And then the hyperscalers just started building. That's when they just started building their own designs. And the government would say, wait a minute, we have to inspect this. Well, and they said, well, it's not a data center, it's something else. So we basically just kind of went off and left them, and the government finally just gave up and said, yeah, we're not gonna regulate. But we went through decades of x86 servers, in pizza boxes, and that morphed into server farms in the cloud. And the last 3 years have just been a absolute exponential change in the data centers, and how they're designed and built.
Do you think if it wasn't for open AI and ChatGPT and generative AI that we'd be in this place, or was that literally the catalyst in late 2022 that changed everything?
Well, you could look at society needing more and more automation and driving these companies to develop these solutions. You could look at it that way, or you could look at it where they develop the ability to be able to deliver the automation that in turn is driving it. It's probably some of both, but it's no one really uh, kind of picked Nvidia as coming out with more and more power hungry GPUs. An evolution every year, basically doubling the power draw. I mean, that wasn't that we saw 25 years the density per rack of the data center go from like 5 to 8, and now and now we're at 132 for the new Blackwell systems.
Yeah, it's very easy to have missed what was very, very slow and very. The only reason I knew NVIDIA coming from the MSP channel world was in the 2000s when you went to go configure a PC like from Dell or someone like that. NVIDIA was the premium option for a graphics card,
Yeah.
which eventually led them to having the R&D and the capabilities and everything to end up where they were in the 2010s. But it would be very easy to have missed them as not a major player in the digital infrastructure space if you go back to the early 2000s.
Yeah, and they were in the gaming industry. and they started to branch off into servers. And it's, when people always ask me, oh, what's the difference? And I say, well, the GPU is, purpose built like a drag racer, like a drag race car, and then the CPU is more like an SUV that can do a lot of things, and not all of them not very well, but GPUs do one thing and do it extremely well. So it's a and we're just paralleling more and more of them together, and to act as a single device, and that's the thing that people don't understand. Why can't you spread out the load? It's because they're processing more and more data, and the more and more data that comes in, and the faster that they get, it's we're condensing that more and more to the point where we're looking at 1 megawatt racks, which is just incredible.
And it seems a lot of this is even dictated both not only the power requirements, but driving a lot of real estate decisions on where to locate these huge hyperscale facilities. I read something a couple of days ago that Meta is looking to build the largest campus in the Western Hemisphere in Louisiana. They got some tax breaks in Louisiana. And as I'm reading about the process that I went through, it almost sounds like what I read about was happening in the 1960s when the Disney brothers didn't like the fact that Disneyland was too small in Anaheim, and they were looking for this huge plot of land in Florida to place the next iteration of the theme park. And it seems like scouting these what's left of these huge parcels to build these massive hyperscale facilities where you can get power.
Yeah, it's incredible what's going on. The size of the campuses from a power perspective. From a real estate perspective, the data center is changing. The IT room is getting much smaller, and then the equipment outside is getting more more generators, more chillers, fields and fields of these chillers. It's unbelievable, some of the designs, and you really can't even recognize the IT racks anymore, like the ones you have in the background here. They're all cluttered with with cooling distribution, piping, and manifolds, and busway, and power draw.
Or the ones where you have the immersion cooling where they're sitting in
tanks,
vats of liquid. Yeah, just insane, right? We're getting scolded if you were going in to go on a tour of a data center, and they're like, you have to get rid of your water bottle. You can't bring it with you. I'm like, okay. Completely different change within a period of a few years. Steve, that's really interesting advice for people that are very early on. And I often have these conversations with people. Is high school early enough? It seems like in a lot of parts of the country, the kids are making these decisions like in 5th, 6th grade as they're entering into middle school with these career academies. But what would you talk about with a colleague that may have worked with 10, 15 years ago, mid-career, that you haven't seen in a while, you bump into at a conference or an airport and used to be really close? You sense they're a little bit burned out and stressed and trying to figure out what to do next to get their career back on track. What would you talk about with that person over lunch or breakfast?
Well, it's, every situation is different, but, if they were burned out and they were really trying, I would talk about, you can only go, so high in your career, doing a great job. At some point, it all flips into, who and what direction the company is going in. And, a lot of people, make the mistake of doing their job, so well and being, ultra dependable, and they don't really understand that a lot of the decisions that are made based on how people can work together at higher levels of the organization. So trying to figure out who you can work well with, and who is on the trajectory and going in the place in the company that you want to go to is one option. Another option is I would ask have they how did they try to change the trajectory of their career? In a lot of cases, they go through proper channels and don't really um, you know one of the things I tell people that I that I that I mentor is, if there's a job out there that you want to do, and you just ask people for approval to do it, they're obviously in most cases going to say no. But if you just start doing the job and start acting like that's your role in the company, then a lot of times the job will kind of come to you. And another thing I tell people is to build their equity outside of the company. Start to publish articles, start to do interviews, start to be known in the industry. And then once people start recognizing outside, it kind of filters back inside, that you are seen as somebody that is a voice in the industry. So there's a lot of people that are burned out, but they haven't really taken the leap of trying to establish their own role outside of the company with their own voice and with their own opinions on where they see things going, or where things could be going. So it is sometimes once you do that, it's like it is a little bit risky, that you're not successful at that, but at least at least you're out there trying. That was some of the best advice I ever got when I was getting my MBA. They were like, get published in the industry, and be recognized as a leader, and then you'll be recognized in your company as well.
And a while back, to get published, there was all kinds of gatekeepers, right? To get
Yeah,
published in trade
exactly.
publications and to speak at conferences, and not quite as rigorous as academia, but definitely there was a pecking order. It seems like now anyone with a LinkedIn profile and YouTube and a blog, assuming their employer doesn't overly regulate or censor or give them stress about doing that, can at least step forward and share their thoughts.
Exactly. And you have to have something to say. I mean, you can't just be disgruntled and complaining about everything. If there's something you're passionate about, that's the other thing is if you have a passion for something, you naturally tend to migrate towards that and do it well.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.
You think for the type of role that you're in right now, where clearly it's an entire career of building up for that, are these typically formal roles that the leadership team is looking for, or has it just become obvious over time that there's someone internally who's done such a masterful job of building their professional brand, building the company's brand, excelled at hitting all their KPIs and OKRs for decades, and that it just naturally seems to fall into place? Or do you see that there actually is a defined path for the kind of role that you're leading right now?
Yeah, most companies, no, there is not a defined path. In my company, no, there was not a defined path. This role kind of emerged because of need in the market. There needed to be somebody to have an opinion on the position on a lot of different things, and because um, it started as strictly an industry type of role, because no one really cared about data centers outside of the data center industry. Now it's emerged into, I mean, the conferences that I go to now and where I speak now are completely different than the industry events that I used to speak about. Those industry events still exist, But now, there's a lot of power conferences that I go to where they want to understand what's happening with data centers and how it's all going to work out. And that's an important part of how the market's going to grow. The collaboration of utilities, grid operators with data center operators is critically important, because there is capacity, there is power capacity if the data center operators and the utilities can play well together. But they're come from completely different cultures. They speak completely different languages, and to get them to work together, takes somebody to be in the middle of that, and that's where kind of Schneider excels. But yeah, this role did not exist, and now it's a role where I'm talking to. This week I talked to BBC. I talked to The Economist. I talked to CIO magazine. So it's really elevated. Data centers have really elevated their presence in a lot of in the minds and in the interest of a lot of these publications.
It seems to map really well too. We track 57 different business models in the ecosystem, and a lot of times people that are like really early on in real estate may not understand the technology part, or understand one part of the operator part or one part of the facility part. But yeah, really it's very, very complex to try to make all of these circles of the Venn diagrams overlap around business interests, even when there really are huge potential at stake.
Yeah, and again, Nvidia's like kind of hit the industry with a cattle prod. And they're just moving so fast that the average person, even if they're trying to understand what's happening, it's not going to understand, because it's really moving at light speed, and the implications on the facilities that we're building, the real estate, is just unbelievable.
Or just this week that they surpassed a $4 trillion market cap, surpassing Apple and Microsoft. And that's where you go to family functions, you get people friends that don't work in anything having to do with IT. And everyone's now heard of OpenAI and has heard of Nvidia because it's been in the mainstream business news for a couple of years. And they're asking your advice.
Yeah, they even know like CoreWeave. They ask me about CoreWeave. They're like, how do you know about CoreWeave? It's incredible. Yeah, they're all out there. There's no shortage of people like, hey, what's the next big AI thing? It's like, well, what's interesting though is, again, nobody really, they've done such a good job putting the system together and the software that sits on top of their GPUs for the developers. Like, a lot of the hyperscalers develop their, billions and billions of dollars through investment and acquisitions, developing their own GPUs and TPUs that they're really not using. It's everybody wants Nvidia. It's back to the old days where, no one ever got fired for buying IBM. It's kind of the same thing with Nvidia now.
Even with the challengers coming in with alternative.
Right. Exactly.
AI chips. Yeah. What's interesting too is if you think about a lot of the esteem that I have for APC and Schneider is fantastic product marketing, fantastic branding, positioning, channel partner relationships. If you think about the close relationship that Nvidia has had with Dell going back decades, because of their PC business, Dell's thrive for the exact same reason. Early on in Dell's life, they swore they didn't need the channel, but by the early 2000s, they've been there since then. But yeah, if you think about elite world-class companies who've figured out their niche, relentless operations, R&D, branding, positioning, growth, channel partner ecosystem, you see a lot of those same parallels with NVIDIA.
Yeah, and we've been working with them now for the last 4 or 5 years, and they're really codependent on us coming out with the power and cooling systems, because designing a data center at 132 kilowatts per rack is not trivial. There are very few people in the world that can do that. So they're really dependent on the reference designs that we provide, so that customers can actually deploy their solutions. And now with Rubin coming out, it's rumored 240 kilowatts per rack, and then in 3 years it's going to be 1 megawatt. It's really important for the industry to have this blueprint to be able to deploy these solutions as they are developed, like I said, at light speed, like a new generation every year.
So from you're saying, it seems like that leadership in the standardization and being able to rally hundreds of relevant companies in the ecosystem around their designs has been a huge part of their success, in much the same way that at some point the USB port was new.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
RS-232 was new. Modems were new. All of this was new at some point.
Yeah. Yeah. Jensen showed, here's our ecosystem of partners. Here's what it takes, to bring these things to deployment, which is, quite amazing.
You see him too, like walking around the expo floors of the conferences, taking thousands and thousands of pictures. He's literally has like that Steve Jobs aura, like celebrity aura now.
Oh yeah. It's an incredible story. And what's interesting about him is, he actually understands. There's a lot of CEOs out there that really don't understand the technology and what their company, does at a deep level. I see him as an engineering CEO where he really understands, and he has the vision of, what it can be, which he talks about quite frequently.
Steve, one thing I also wanted to get your thoughts on is where we're headed in the next 2, 3, 4 years for the kind of role that you're in right now, where you're leading innovation, working in ecosystems, being Schneider's lead person out in front with AI and high performance computing. What do you envision changing in the next 2, 3, 4 years?
Yeah, we've already talked about, kind of the technology changing. And, the number one question that I get, besides how we're going to power all these data centers is this a bubble? Are we heading for a bubble? And, we don't see a bubble. We don't see any kind of let up with the forecast and the orders that we're receiving for this build out. So it's kind of for the next 2 or 3 years, the trajectory is kind of still in a race. It's still a race, and there's lots of companies out there deploying, the latest and greatest technologies to be able to win this race. We're starting to see, much more interest in Europe. Europe, I think, was a little bit skeptical, and they were a little slow to, kind of adapt. Now they're starting to pour more and more money into it. But you see Asia, you see places like, you see different industries getting into this as well. In the Middle East, a lot of the oil companies, are trying to build, data centers, and the oil and gas companies are saying, oh, we could build these natural gas turbines and make them, very, very green, which is great, great for the industry. So where I see the industry going is, and we talked about it a little bit, is, the old way of building, designing and building a data center and deploying it. You had a spec, you had an engineer, and you put it all out for quotes, and people quoted the different components, and then you kind of put it together. Those days are over. It's we are doing these prefabricated modules for the IT room at 132 kilowatts per rack that have everything already pre-wired and all the connections for all the cooling pre-done and built in a factory. And that's the way that we're seeing, the go-to-market for a lot of these. They're going to buy these prefabricated modules, roll them in place, roll in the Nvidia or whoever's GPU servers, and then hook them up, because they can't design them themselves anymore at these densities. So they're going to have to, rely on these types of modules, which are faster, more cost efficient to be able to do. And as the densities go up, the number of racks, keeps going down a little bit. So it's going to be more into this solution prefabricate. That's kind of how liquid cooling is being done now. It's being done like, they buy the chillers, they'll buy the CDUs, they'll buy, the servers, and then they kind of put it together in the control system. Somebody has to come in and get it running before they can, optimize it. So it's a really complicated process. But if you could package it together and spec it all out together as a solution, it would be much simpler.
So if modular data centers laid the framework for this in the 2010s, what we're basically seeing now is a lot more manufactured assemblies of what would have previously been done by different kinds of integrators and channel partners.
Yeah, and we were very early in the prefab, and we really believed it. We made an acquisition, in Spain, a company called AST that we thought it was going to take off, 15 years ago, and now it's multi-billion-dollar business. It's amazing that that it's because of what's happened with the densities that there's a lot more um, reason to do a solution like that than there used to be.
With all of this change happening at the macro, at the industry level, how do you see your own daily, weekly routines changing?
Yeah, like I said, it's the number of investor relation people I talk to, is a lot higher, and the number of people that are interested, the different industries and the different types of you know of you know press analysts, the number of analysts that are covering data centers now, I think just doubled, over the last 6 months. We're getting all this interest. Hey, we want to talk to you and show you what we have. It's just amazing. So my role is less. It's more about taking this very, very complicated technical thing that's going on in the data center industry and kind of communicating that in a way that a lot of people can understand.
So it seems like there's been this emergence of investor relations related work that's popped up in the last couple of years just because there's so much more capital going into the space.
There's so much more capital, yeah, and it's driving a lot of the growth of a lot of companies. So it's the question is still not crystal clear, how a lot of these hyperscalers that have invested these billions of dollars in AI, how that's going to be returned. But it's starting to. That's the other shift that's going on, is we have all these models now, and we have some applications that are starting to emerge. Kind of the chatbot thing, and customer service is the obvious one that you can't talk to a human, but pretty soon you're not going to know you're not talking to a human. That's going to be the interesting part. But financial services is a big marketing, firmware and coding. There's a big battle going on. I saw an article today where some of the firmware coders that AI is taking a lot of those jobs. They're saying, "Oh, I can still do it faster, without AI." So there's a lot of that going on, but you're going to start to see kind of this wave of applications, and of applications that are these autonomous agents or agentic AI that are going to kind of operate on their own, are going to need a lot more compute capacity, and that's what's kind of driving the need to build out all of these AI data centers, and why there seems to be like this endless need to build out more capacity.
I think there's a lot of confusion going on as well as to whether we have a talent acquisition problem or we're oversaturated in certain areas, because I see there's been this big emergence of like the data center recruiter executive search firm over the last 3 or 4 years talking about how there's all these pockets that they can't hire enough. But at the same time, you see a lot of companies shedding talent, and you see some of the hyperscalers offering salaries that would have normally been reserved for like baseball stars, like $200 million salaries for the AI superstar for a hyperscale to pluck them away from a competitor. It seems crazy. So what do you make of all of this?
Yeah, it's an interesting time. I think, again, the AI race is not just between companies, it's between countries. And then it's, between companies. And then it's, everyone's looking for the applications that they're going to be able to monetize, and be the company that's kind of the cornerstone of all of these agents that are going to permeate through a lot of industries. So that's whoever wins that is gonna really clean up.
It's like this winner takes, they're looking at that this is another version of mobile or cloud 10, 15, 20 years ago, and this is the new arms race.
Yeah, the cloud was interesting because people had a hard time to understand exactly what cloud was. I know we'd be on these panels, it's infrastructure, platform as a service, software as a service. Well, what is this cloud?
They were scared of it too, and it wasn't just fear of it taking their jobs. They were literally scared of the security ramifications.
Exactly, and they still are. A lot of companies, they still want to send a lot of information to the cloud, which is just bizarre. But I think this is a little different. It's a little different than cloud, because if we would have just said, yeah, it's just these big data centers that are where you're going to house a lot of your information, people have been, oh, okay, that's the cloud. but AI and where AI is going to live, there's still, we're seeing, I predicted that there's going to be more smaller optimized applications at the edge, which still could happen. We're not seeing a lot of that, though. We're seeing a lot of, let's build these AI clusters, for training, and then, when they're not training, we're going to use those to operate the inference and the working models or the reasoning models, whatever you want to call them. So we're seeing that kind of capacity being built out a lot more than moving to the edge. I think once there's a little bit more maturity in some of the applications, we'll start to see that. But right now, it's still being done in these larger data center AI clusters.
Which is interesting, because there seems to be a lot of interest in building out an investment in edge at the intersection of AI.
Yeah, and it's we predicted that would happen, and we're hoping it will happen, but it's all these proof of concepts and these pilots. Johnson and Johnson famously ran 1,000, and they picked 3. Like, oh, these are the 3 that worked, so we're gonna go with these 3. But it's now people are thinking, getting more mature on at least the pilot phase, so they go into it, with the expectation of what's going to happen. I think it will mature, and it will roll out. It's just a question of when.
Speaking of apps and productivity and use cases, do you have any favorites that if someone from your IT organization or finance organization was coming to you and saying, hey, we're trying to narrow down the list of what's supported versus not supported? I imagine you're at a place in Schneider Electric where you have a lot of pull to get a lot of your favorite apps in place, but imagine someone like yourself a little earlier on in their career. What would you fight hard to hold on to, because it's indispensable for how you do your job?
Well, I think with the they keep rolling out different apps, designed to help productivity, and they keep changing a lot of the AI apps. And I actually, in my role where I write a lot, I actually am a big advocate to not looking at any AI for things that you're writing, because what's happening is a lot of the content that's being written is being duplicated, and the AI agents are finding it and duplicating it again, and it's just building on itself to the point where there's a big lack of original content that's being developed. I mean, I was interviewing, for an intern, and we give them a project, right? It was a very specific, write 1.5 pages on this. And it was obvious they all just went to Chat GPT-3, because they all wrote the same thing. It was, slightly different, because Chat GPT changes a little bit every time it gives you a response. But it was like, so I'm a little worried that there's going to be this lack of the original content that's coming out.
Imagine you're at this stage with hundreds of blog posts out there and dozens or hundreds of hours of video out there. Someone is literally thinking, the Carlini bot, Carlini GPT. Let me see how I can reverse engineer how to make the perfect assignment that Steve's going to love.
Yeah, it's a different world, that's for sure. And it's early on. If you had enough scale, you could write something completely absurd, and it would get picked up, and that would be the standard.
Wow.
Like Wembley Stadium only has 3 seats, something like that. And then you just put it everywhere, and then they find it, and that becomes like, oh no, that's what it is. So that's what it learned. So it's hopefully a lot of that doesn't happen going forward. But that's also a risk, that you have all this bad information that is built on it and extrapolated into really bad information.
It seems like the hallucination factor has become less of an issue over the past year or two, but yeah, there's still has to be some oversight.
And the hallucination factor is, it's kind of managed by originally managed by throwing a lot of humans at it to verify it. So, so that's how they fixed it.
That was the approach that I saw a lot of SaaS companies doing in the mid to late 2010s. As early on, they had their models, but they were supplementing the models by inexpensive BPO workers,
right,
getting paid a few dollars an hour to QA all of the stuff or curate all of this stuff. So you could never really tell what was AI and what was human.
Yeah.
Everyone's in the tagging business, but eventually, there's a lot of competition for the models to keep improving this. But Steve, this has really been fascinating. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk through your macro view on where you see the industry is going, how Schneider is packaging together a lot of discrete components to make these high density racks more of a reality, where this fits in with career paths going forward, where we're headed next. It's really a fascinating time. If someone wants to keep up with what you're working on, what you're publishing, or reach out to you, is LinkedIn the best place?
Yeah, I would say LinkedIn's the best place. It seems to be the kind of the centerpiece of where everybody goes these days.
And for someone that just wants to learn more about what Schneider Electric is doing at the intersection of data centers, AI, high performance computing, do you have a favorite resource? LinkedIn, website, anything like that?
You could go to the Schneider Electric website. We use that as kind of our core, and then we have other satellite websites that are more on the innovation side that we link to that.
Cool. Yeah, we'll make sure to include links to those in the blog post and the show notes along with this episode. But it's been terrific. I've been speaking today with Steve Carlini, who is the VP of Data Center and Innovation, as well as the Chief Evangelist of AI and High Performance Computing for Schneider Electric, based in the greater Boston area. Steve, thanks so much for joining me.
No, it's great. Thanks for having me.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.